The prophet Isaiah prophesies about a coming Jesus, God who will be with us. And he tells us that when that Jesus comes, that his mother will name him Emmanuel, or God with us. And we're going to talk about what it means to worship and to serve and to follow and to love and to worship a God who is with us, a God who is present here on this earth with us. And we're going to spend just 4 kind of brief sessions together during this Advent season, exploring and asking questions. And the question that we're asking right now is, what does it mean to worship a God who is with us? And what does it mean to have an Emmanuel who is with his people? And as I posed that question to myself and as I looked into the scripture, I noticed kind of a pattern and a red thread, and this red thread runs from Genesis to the book, all the way through Scripture to the end of the story in the book of Revelation. And that red thread is the fact that we do worship a God who has always come near to his people, a God who is with us, a God who is and has been and always will be our Emmanuel, God with us. God is seen in the Old Testament as being with his people. We see it even in Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve and mankind have failed to keep the one and only rule of the garden. And Genesis 3 tells us that God is there with his people. He goes in search of his people despite their rebellion. And he says that he is walking in the cool of the day in the garden because we have always had a God who desires to be with his people. So we see it in the book of Genesis. We see it in the Old Testament, where God of heaven and earth is coming down to be among his people. And he speaks to the patriarchs and he makes promises to them, and especially promises to a man named Abraham. And he revisits Abraham and so that he can remind him of the covenant that he's made with him and remind him of the promise. And God comes near to Abraham and speaks to him and is present with him. And I'm just thinking of how important it is to know that not only do we have celebrate this season of Christmas with a Jesus who is Emmanuel, God with us, but we have always had a God who has been with us. And I can't think of a more important time to be reminded of that in this kind of season of isolation, this season of loneliness, this season of fear and uncertainty, and how important it is that we can rest and contemplate and fix our mind on the fact that we worship an Emmanuel God who is with us. And so God was with Adam and Eve in the garden, and God was with the patriarchs and with his people throughout the Old Testament. And he made that promise to Abraham that he would give him a people and a nation, and that he would give him land and an inheritance, and that he would bless the nations through Abraham. And 400 years pass, and then in the book of Exodus, we learn that God is going to fulfill that. And once again, he's coming near to his people, and he comes to a man named Moses, and he tells Moses that he's going to use him to set his people free and to set captives free and to bring the people into that promised land that he had promised to Abraham. And when God delivers the people through the hand of Moses, and he takes them out of the land of Egypt, and he takes them through the Red Sea, and this dramatic delivery where the wall of the seas are before them and Pharaoh's armies are behind them, and God delivers them on dry ground. And then he takes them to a place called Mount Sinai, and it's there that he's going to meet with his people, that he's going to come near to them, that he's going to speak to them, that he's going to reveal himself to them, that he's going to be present with them in a powerful way, in a way that he hasn't been present with them in over 400 years. And he takes them to Mount Sinai, and not only does he give them the law and teach them what it means to worship a living God and what it means to live set apart from the nations of this world, but he also gives them a blueprint for something he calls the tabernacle. And he tells Moses in Exodus chapter 25, he says, I want you to build me a dwelling place. I want you to build me a sanctuary or a tabernacle, because here's the heart of God. And not just at the coming of Jesus, but the heart of God has always been to be near his people. And he says, build me a tabernacle that I might dwell among my people. And he gives Moses these instructions, and he tells him how to lay out the tabernacle and what material to use and what to lay in gold and silver and what sacred pieces to make, and the priestly garments he talks about. And God says that it's in this holy of holy place, in the midst of the tabernacle, that I will seat myself on the mercy seat. I will place myself under the cherubim, and my presence will exist on the mercy seat. And he says that he will lead his people from that place, that he wants to be among them and with them and be in their presence in a new way, that he is a God, he is an Emmanuel God who is with us. And so as God is giving these instructions to Moses, and he's telling him how to construct the tabernacle, because he has this desire to be among his people and to dwell there with them, to tabernacle with them, to be physically present with them. And as he's giving these instructions to Moses, Moses is up on the mountain, and the people grow weary of waiting, and they are fearful that Moses won't return, and that God has led them out into the desert and then somehow abandoned them, and he's no longer with them. And so they worship a golden calf. And as Moses is coming down from the mountain, just having received the 2 tablets of the stone commandments that Scripture tells us are written by the finger of God, and he brings these 2 stone tablets down, and with him he also brings this blueprint for the tabernacle, that God might dwell in the midst of his people. And when he comes down, he sees the golden calf, and God would have been justified to destroy the people, but he relents of that judgment on his people. His desire to be among them is great. But he says that they will resume the journey, that they will continue on into the promised land. But in Exodus chapter 33, he warns Moses, and he tells Moses, he says, go and move forward into the promised land, and an angel will go with you. But in Exodus chapter 33, verse 3, he says this. These are really scary words to me. He says, I will not go up in your midst. I will not go with you. And as you can imagine, Moses is just terrified by the thought of him leading over 2 million people across the desert to claim the promise of God without the presence of God. And Moses speaks to God, and he says in verse 15, he says, if your presence does not go with us, do not lead us up from here. Can you imagine if God were not present with us? If he weren't present in the midst of a global pandemic, if he wasn't present with us in the midst of so much financial insecurity and fear, if he wasn't with us and present with us in the hour of our greatest need, and what if he didn't promise to be near to us? And what if he wasn't an Emmanuel God, a God who was with us? And what if his presence wasn't with us? Not just on Christmas or on some other day, but throughout this whole season that we've been experiencing this isolation and this loneliness and this fear and uncertainty. And so Moses feels that pressure that, God, if you're not in this with us, don't take us up from here. And I think that's our heart cry as followers of Jesus during this Advent season. And that is, Jesus, if you're not present with us in this, in the midst of this calamity that we're experiencing, in the midst of this isolation and fear, then we can't go on without you. And so Moses understands that, and he cries out to God and says, if you don't go with us, don't take us up from here. And then he issues this plea to God, and he says, God, please show me your glory. And God does that, and he sets Moses on a mountain in the cleft of a rock, and he promises to basically parade his presence before Moses. He promises to bring his presence near to him and reassures him that he will go with him, that Moses won't have to endure this season of hardship and this season of confusion and not knowing where he's going and not having the answers and having to lead these people that are known to be obstinate and stiff-necked. And so God says, I'll make my glory pass before you. And so he hides Moses in the cleft of the rock. And then God parades his glory before Moses. And he says, I am a God of compassion and mercy. And I visit and have compassion on whom I want to have compassion. And I'm a God of justice. And so he parades himself before Moses. And just two questions that I encourage you to contemplate just in this first little season of Advent. And that is, one, what does it mean to worship a God who is with us, an Emmanuel God who is with his people? What must that be like, that we worship that type of a God? And then the second question is, what if we had heard the words that were spoken to Moses, and that is, I will not go with you. I will not be present. I will not be with you on the journey, but you'll have to take the journey without my presence. Like, what would it be like to not have a God who was with us, a God who was not present on the journey, a God who wasn't with us in the isolation, a God who wasn't with us in the fear and the uncertainty, and yet we have a God who is near. Isaiah 7:14. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign, and behold, a virgin will be with child, and she will bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. We have hope this Advent season because God has always had a history of wanting to be near his people, and he has made us promises that he will be near to us.